The message from nowhere. The stars stretched across the vast darkness of space. The lonely ship, UN Valiant, floated near the dead colony of EO7. It had been a long journey, but Captain Elena Carter and her crew were used to that. The United Earth Navy had sent them to investigate the abandoned colony. 20 years ago, all communication from EO7 had stopped. No distress calls. No survivors. No men were ever found again. Elena stood on the bridge of her ship, staring at the holographic screen. Her first officer, Lieutenant Marco Reyes, sat at the control panel, his fingers tapping the glowing buttons. "Captain, we are now in EO7's orbit," Reyes said. Elena nodded. "Scan for any life signs." The screen flickered as the ship's scanners swept the planet. The results appeared in seconds. No human signals detected, just like everyone expected. But then, a sound. A faint, broken transmission. Reyes frowned. "Captain, we're picking up a signal." Elena turned sharply. "From where?" Reyes tapped the console, increasing the volume. A crackling voice filled the bridge. It was deep, rough, and undeniably human. "You're still hesitating. Get over here, human." Elena's heart froze. The entire crew fell silent. That was a man's voice. Impossible. Men were wiped out from EO7 20 years ago. "Is this a recording?" Reyes asked, his voice uneasy. The transmission repeated, "You're still hesitating. Get over here, human." Elena clenched her jaw. This wasn't normal. It wasn't a distress call. It sounded more like a challenge. She turned to Ensign Priya Patel, the ship's communications officer. "Can you trace the signal?" Priya's fingers flew over the keyboard. "It's coming from the planet's surface, near the old command center." "But Captain, something's wrong." "What is it?" "The signal isn't automated. It's live." The crew exchanged nervous glances. A live human transmission. That was impossible. Reyes exhaled. "If that's really a man down there, it means someone survived." Elena nodded, her mind racing. The United Earth Navy had abandoned this colony decades ago. They had left men behind. Could this be one of them? Or was it a trap? Elena made her decision. "We're going down. Full gear. Be ready for anything." The descent to EO7. The landing craft roared through the sky, piercing the thick, red clouds of EO7. Below them, the planet looked like a graveyard. The colony was once a thriving human settlement. Now, it was a wasteland. Dark buildings stood half-collapsed, overgrown with strange alien vines. Vehicles lay rusted and broken. Skeletons of mechs and humans scattered across the streets. The landing craft touched the ground with a soft thud. The ramp lowered, and Elena stepped out first, her pulse steady but alert. Her team followed. Reyes, Priya, and 3 armed security officers. Their boots crunched against the cracked pavement. The air was cold, heavy with the smell of metal and decay. Elena spoke into her helmet's mic. "We move in, quiet and fast. If this is a survivor, we bring him in. If it's a trap, we deal with it." They made their way through the ruined streets, weapons ready. Shadows moved in the alleys, but when they turned to look, nothing was there. EO7 was watching them. Then they reached the command center, a tall, dark structure covered in alien growth. The door hung open, swaying slightly. Priya whispered, "The signal is coming from inside." Elena took a breath. "Let's go." The man who shouldn't exist. The air inside was thick and stale. Dust covered the walls. Flickering lights cast eerie shadows as the team moved in. Then, a noise. A footstep. Elena raised her rifle. "Who's there?" Silence. Then, from the darkness, a figure stepped out. He was tall, muscular, and armed. His face was scared, his hair long and wild. His eyes, sharp, burning with anger. A man. A real, living, breathing man. The team froze, stunned beyond words. The man's voice was deep, rough from years of solitude. The same voice from the transmission. 20 years without men, and you're still hesitating, he growled. Get over here, human. Alina's grip tightened on her gun. Who are you? The man smirked. The only one they left behind. The room fell into silence. And then, from the shadows behind him, something moved. The dead colony and the hidden survivor. The air inside the abandoned command center was thick with dust and decay. Flickering lights cast eerie shadows on the cracked walls, and the faint hum of dead technology echoed through the empty halls. Captain Alina Carter stood still, her pulse pounding in her ears. In front of her stood a man, a real, breathing human male, something that should not exist on EO7. His body was scared, lean, and hardened by survival. His dark, unkempt hair fell over his face, barely covering the cold, sharp gaze of a predator. He gripped a heavy modified rifle, its barrel glowing faintly with energy, ready to fire at a second's notice. Alina's team stared in shock. No man had been seen alive in this colony for 20 years. Yet here he was, standing before them. His voice broke the silence again, rough and full of challenge. 20 years without men, and you're still hesitating. Get over here, human. Alina tightened her grip on her weapon, scanning his expressions, body language, the way his muscles tensed slightly. Ready for a fight. Who are you? She demanded. The man smirked, though there was no humor in it. Damien Wolf, the last man standing. Alina's mind raced. She had heard that name before, long ago. A soldier in the United Earth Navy, listed as MIA after EO7 fell. No body was ever recovered. The official report claimed no survivors. Yet here he was. And then, something moved behind him. The shadows that watch. A slow, slithering noise, a whisper of movement in the darkness. Damien stepped forward, lowering his rifle but not holstering it. If you're smart, you'll keep your voices down, he said. His tone was calm, but there was an edge of warning. We're not alone. Alina exchanged glances with Reyes, who nodded and silently activated his thermal scanner. The results flashed on his visor. His face paled instantly. Captain, we're surrounded, Reyes whispered. Alina looked at the scanner. Shapes, tall, elongated, twisting unnaturally, clung to the ceilings and walls, watching them from the shadows. Their movements were slow, deliberate, patient. Something alien. Damien sighed and slung his rifle over his back. Good. Now that you see them, you'll believe me. Alina's voice was low and steady. What are they? Damien turned and started walking deeper into the command center. If you want to live, you better follow me. Alina hesitated, but something deep in her gut told her he knew this place better than they did. Move, she ordered her team. They followed Damien through the ruined halls. The shapes in the shadows didn't attack. They just watched. The truth about EO7. Damien led them into an old war room, filled with broken monitors and flickering screens. A makeshift base had been set up here. Food supplies, weapon crates, even a crude sleeping area. He turned to face them, his expression hard. You want answers? Fine. But I hope you can handle the truth. Alina folded her arms. Start talking. Damien exhaled, rubbing his temple. The UEN abandoned this colony 20 years ago. You know that much. What you don't know is, they didn't just leave us behind. They sacrificed us. The room fell dead silent. Alina felt something cold settle in her chest. What do you mean? Damien's jaw clenched. EO7 wasn't attacked by some random alien species. The Drelzor didn't invade. Alina frowned. That name isn't in any UEN records. Damien scoffed. Of course it isn't, because the UEN covered it up. He leaned forward, eyes sharp. The Drelzor came here for one reason, to take human men. They didn't want resources. They didn't want war. They'd wanted breeders. The words hit like a hammer. Alina's team shifted uncomfortably. No one spoke. Damien continued. The Drellzor are a dying species. Their males are extinct. They needed replacements. And guess what? Human DNA was a perfect match. Alina shook her head slowly. You're saying they harvested human men? Damien nodded. Took them. Experimented on them. Changed them. Priya, the communications officer, swallowed hard. What happened to them? Damien's expression darkened. His next words were spoken quietly, but they carried the weight of 20 years of horror. They're not human anymore. The horror beneath the colony. A deep guttural growl echoed from the hall outside. The shadows moved. Alina's team raised their weapons instantly, backing toward the center of the room. Damien sighed. Looks like we took too long. The ceiling cracked. A long skeletal limb with razor-sharp claws lowered from above. A creature began to emerge, tall, thin. Its humanoid frame twisted unnaturally. Its skin stretched and pale. Its face was disturbingly familiar. It had once been human. But now, it was something else. Priya gasped in horror, stepping back. Oh my God. Damien pulled out a shock grenade and tossed it at the creature's feet. Time to run. Boom. The flash detonated, sending a shockwave through the hall, knocking the creature back. Move-y, Alina shouted. The team sprinted down the corridor, following Damien. Behind them, the creatures screamed, their cries echoing through the dead colony. Alina's mind raced. This mission was no longer about investigating the dead colony. It was about surviving. And learning the terrifying truth about what happened to human men on EO7. The alien truth and the coming storm. The air inside the abandoned colony was thick with tension. Alina and her team had just escaped the war room, but the truth still echoed in her mind. Men had not been killed on EO7. They had been taken. Change. And the creatures hunting them now. They were the missing men. The realization sat in her gut like a cold stone. She kept running, her boots slamming against the cracked floor as Damien led them through the ruins. Behind them, inhuman screams tore through the corridors. The creatures, once human men, were hunting them. We can't outrun them for long, Rais shouted, gripping his rifle tightly. We don't need to outrun them, Damien growled. We just need to make it to the tunnels. Alina didn't like the sound of that. What tunnels? Damien shot her a quick glance. The ones the UEN never told you about. Before she could demand answers, a creature dropped from the ceiling ahead of them. It landed on all fours. Its limbs too long, fingers sharpened into claws, its mouth a jagged mess of broken human teeth. Its eyes, hollow and glowing, locked onto them. It was wearing torn UEN armor. Alina's breath hitched. This thing had once been a soldier. It charged. The fight for survival. Open fire, Alina shouted. The team unleashed hell, bullets, and plasma rounds ripping through the air. The creature shrieked, its flesh burning but not stopping. It lunged at Rais. Damien moved faster than a man should, grabbing Rais and yanking him aside just before the creature's claws sliced the air where his head had been. Then, in one smooth motion, Damien pulled a blade from his belt, a long curved knife carved from alien bone, and plunged it into the creature's skull. The creature spasmed and let out an ear-piercing screech before collapsing, its body twitching violently. Silence. Everyone stood frozen, weapons still aimed. Damien yanked his knife free and wiped the blackened blood off his sleeve. They're not invincible, he muttered, but they don't go down easy. Alina was still staring at the corpse. How did you? Damien cut her off. Move. Now. The team didn't argue. They followed him through the ruins, leaving the twisted corpse behind. The hidden tunnels of EO7. After several minutes of running, they arrived at a massive rusted hatch built into the ground. Damien knelt beside it, punching a series of codes into an old manual keypad. The locks hissed, gears grinding as the hatch slowly opened. Elena stared. This wasn't in the colony's blueprints. Of course not, Damien said as he climbed in. This is where they kept their secrets. One by one, they descended into the darkness below. The underground nightmare. The tunnel smelled of metal, sweat, and something rotten. The walls were lined with faded UN insignias, but the deeper they went, the more those insignias were covered by alien growths. Veins of pulsating, organic material that seemed alive. Elena ran her fingers along the wall. It was warm. What the hell is this place? Rise muttered. Damien stopped at a rusted doorway, then ripped it open. Inside, the room was filled with massive glass containment pods. Each one held a human man, or what used to be one. Their bodies were suspended in thick liquid, their skin stretched, mutated. Some had elongated limbs, others had dark veins crawling beneath their flesh. Elena's stomach twisted. Priya gasped. My God, they're still alive. Damien clenched his fists. Not for long. Elena turned to him. You knew this was here. His voice was sharp. Of course I knew. I was in one of those pods. The team stared at him in shock. Damien took a step closer to one of the pods. The man inside twitched, his eyes snapping open. A single whispered word left his lips. Help. Elena made a decision. We're getting them out. Damien grabbed her wrist fast and hard. You don't get it. His voice was cold. These men, they're not coming back. They're already changing. The process is slow, but once it starts, there's no stopping it. Elena refused to believe that. We can't just leave them. Damien exhaled, looking at the ground. When he spoke, his voice was haunted. You think I don't want to save them. You think I didn't try. He shook his head. You're not ready to know the truth. Then, alarms blared. A deep, rumbling growl echoed through the tunnels. Damien's expression darkened. And now you don't have time to learn it. The coming storm. The tunnel shook violently. From the far end, a wave of creatures began crawling through the walls, ceilings, and vents. Dozens of them. Priya screamed. There's too many. Damien grabbed Elena's rifle and tossed it to her. If you want to live, you'd better start shooting. Elena gritted her teeth and opened fire. The tunnels erupted in chaos. Bullets, plasma rounds, and energy grenades tore through the creatures, but more kept coming. Ray shouted over the noise. We can't hold this position. Damien grabbed a charge from his belt. We're not staying. He hurled the explosive at the containment pods. No, Elena shouted, but it was too late. Boom. The pods shattered, liquid, and glass flying everywhere. The twisted men inside began convulsing violently, their transformation accelerating. Then they started screaming. A new kind of scream. Angry, violent, free. And suddenly, they weren't just victims anymore. They were monsters. Elena cursed as one of them lunged at her. Damien tackled it to the ground, plunging his alien knife into its throat. Blood sprayed across the walls. This is what they wanted, Damien growled. They're not men anymore. They're weapons. Elena's mind raced. The UEN had known all along. This wasn't just an abandoned colony. It was a breeding ground for an army. And now, that army was awake. Move-y, Damien shouted. The team ran for their lives as the tunnels collapsed behind them. And in the dark, the newly awakened creatures howled in rage. The hive and the dark reality. The tunnels shook violently, dust and debris raining from the ceiling. Elena barely managed to stay on her feet as the mutated creatures, once human men, screeched and clawed their way toward them. The echoes of their twisted, inhuman screams bounced off the cold metal walls, filling the air with terror. Her team was running out of options. Reyes fired his rifle, sending bright streaks of plasma into the advancing monsters. We can't keep this up, he shouted, his voice strained from exertion. I know. Elena snapped, her mind racing. They needed an exit. Now. Damien Wolf, the lone survivor of EO7, sprinted beside them, his face grim. He knew something they didn't. "We go deeper," he yelled over the chaos. Alina turned to him, stunned. "Deeper? Are you insane?" Damien grabbed her by the arm mid-run, his grip like iron. "You want to live. You follow me." There was no time for debate. With a final look at the nightmare behind them, humanity's lost sons turned into monstrosities, Alina gave the order. "Move." Into the tunnels. The descent into hell. The team plunged deeper into the underground labyrinth. The air grew thicker, hotter, carrying the stench of rot and something sickly sweet, a smell Alina couldn't place, but one that filled her with a primal fear. The walls were no longer metal. They were alive, organic, pulsating, breathing. Strange veins ran along the corridors, glowing with a faint, sickly blue light, like alien blood vessels feeding some enormous body. Reyes swallowed hard, his voice almost a whisper. "What the hell is this place?" Damien kept moving, his expression cold. "The hive." The word hung in the air, thick with meaning. Damien stopped at a large, circular door covered in organic matter. It looked like it had been grown, not built. He turned back to them. "What you're about to see will change everything." Then, without waiting for permission, he reached forward and pushed his hand against the door. It shuddered, as if sensing his presence. Then, it peeled open like a massive living wound. And beyond it, the truth was waiting. The chamber of the forgotten. The room was massive, stretching far beyond what the eye could see. It wasn't built, it was grown, a cathedral of alien horror. And in the center, suspended in thick, translucent cocoons, were hundreds of human men. Alina felt her breath catch in her throat. Priya, their communications officer, took a slow, trembling step forward. "Are they alive?" Damien's jaw tightened. Yes. The cocoons pulsed rhythmically, like beating hearts. Inside, the men twitched, their faces contorted in pain. Some looked almost normal, except for their eyes, glowing faintly. Others were further along, their bodies twisted, reshaped, no longer fully human. Reyes gagged, turning away. This is sick." Alina forced herself to move closer, her boots sinking slightly into the organic floor. She stared at the men inside the pods. Some of them looked familiar. Her heart stopped. She knew some of them. These were UEN soldiers, missing officers, pilots, commanders, men they had declared dead. Her hands clenched into fists. The UEN knew. Damien exhaled sharply. Of course they did. Alina turned to him, her rage barely contained. Then why? Why let this happen? Damien finally looked at her. His face, for the first time, showed something more than anger. It showed pain. Because the UEN made a deal with them. The horrific truth. Alina's blood ran cold. Priya shook her head, not wanting to believe it. "No, that's not possible." Damien gave a hollow, bitter laugh. "Isn't it? Think about it, Captain. You think a whole colony just gets wiped out and the UEN decides, oh well, guess we'll leave. No, they left us here on purpose." Reyes looked around, horror dawning in his eyes. They traded human men to the Drelzor. Damien nodded. For peace, for technology, for power. His voice grew sharper. EO7 was a sacrifice. Alina's hands shook with fury. She had fought wars for the UEN. She had trusted them. And now, she realized, they had been lying to her all along. Before she could respond, the chamber shuddered violently. Then, the Queen spoke. The voice of the Drelzor. A deep, resonant voice filled the chamber. It wasn't spoken aloud. It was inside their minds. "You are not meant to be here, humans." The cocoons trembled, as if responding to the voice. And then, from the darkness above, she emerged. The Drelzor Queen descended from the ceiling, her massive, elongated form slithering down, her black, glass-like eyes locking onto them. She was beyond monstrous, her humanoid upper body twisted and elegant, her lower half a mass of coiling tendrils, pulsating with life. She studied Elena with something that almost resembled curiosity. "You are too late," the Queen whispered. "The transformation is already complete." She gestured toward the pods. And then, the cocoons began to break. One by one, the figures inside began to awaken. Their bodies twisted, their faces contorted, their voices no longer human. They were not men anymore. They were the future of the Drelzor. And they were very, very hungry. Damien yelled, "Run!" The rescue and the betrayal. The moment the first cocoon split open, Elena knew they were out of time. A horrible squelching sound echoed through the massive underground hive as the first transformed soldier crawled free. He, or what used to be him, staggered forward, dripping with the thick, translucent fluid that had kept him in stasis. His eyes, once human, now glowed an eerie blue. His skin was stretched too tight, his limbs elongated, his fingers tipped with razor-sharp claws. He lifted his head toward Elena's team. A sound, half human, half monster, rattled in his throat. Then dozens of other cocoons began breaking. The air filled with sickening wet pops as more mutated figures began to emerge. Elena snapped out of her shock. "Weapons up," she ordered. Damien didn't wait for the command. He had already pulled out a plasma rifle, aiming at the first creature's chest. Boom! A flash of blue energy ripped through its torso, sending it crashing backward. For a brief moment, the hive went still. Then, they all screamed. A deafening, unnatural shriek erupted from the transformed men, vibrating the walls, rattling inside Elena's skull. And then they charge. The battle inside the hive. "Fall back," Elena yelled. The team unleashed hell, gunfire lighting up the darkness. Plasma bolts and explosive rounds ripped into the creatures, but they didn't go down easily. One of them leaped through the air, landing on Priya, knocking her flat. Its claws tore through her shoulder armor, metal screeching as it tried to reach the soft flesh beneath. Priy. Rice fired at point-blank range, blasting the creature's head apart. Priya scrambled backward, clutching her bleeding shoulder. Elena pulled a shock grenade from her belt, slamming it onto the ground. Boom! A white-hot shockwave rippled through the chamber, momentarily stunning the creatures. "Run!" she shouted. They sprinted toward the exit, dodging swinging claws and lunging bodies. The Drelzor Queen watched silently, perched above, her expression almost amused. Just as they neared the tunnel exit, a thunderous boom shook the entire chamber. The entrance collapsed in front of them, trapping them inside. Betrayal in the dark. Elena's mind raced. They had one chance left. She turned to Damien. "Is there another way out?" Damien hesitated. "There is, but you're not going to like it." Before he could explain, Reyes groaned and fell to his knees. Elena rushed to him. "Reyes, what's wrong?" He clutched his side, his breathing ragged. I don't know. My head feels." He screamed, a raw, guttural sound, and collapsed completely. Elena's blood turned to ice. Then behind her, Priya let out a sharp breath. Elena spun around, just in time to see Priya raising her weapon at her. For a single moment, the entire world slowed down. Elena saw it in Priya's face. Guilt, pain, but no hesitation. Priya pulled the trigger. Elena dove aside, the plasma bolt searing past her face. Reyes, still writhing on the ground, gasped in shock. Priya. The betrayal hit harder than any bullet. Damien's reaction was immediate. He lunged at Priya, knocking her weapon away, pinning her to the ground. Elena rolled to her feet, her gun trained on Priya's trembling body. "Why?" she demanded. Praya's lips trembled. I'm sorry, Captain. She sucked in a shaky breath. I was ordered to do this. Belena's grip tightened on the gun. Ordered by who? Silence. Then, a voice crackled over their comms. A cold, familiar voice. By me. Elena's stomach dropped. Because she knew that voice. Admiral John Mercer, United Earth Navy. Her commanding officer. The Admiral's true mission. Captain Carter. Mercer's voice came through the earpiece, steady and devoid of emotion. Stand down. This mission is over. Belena's hands clenched into fists. You set us up. Mercer continued as if she hadn't spoken. You were never meant to leave EO7. The Drellzor have agreed to continue the peace treaty. In exchange, they requested more resources. Elena's blood ran cold. More resources. He meant human men. We were never sent to investigate, were we? She whispered. You sent us here to cover up the truth. Mercer sighed. I'm afraid you're thinking too small, Captain. This isn't about a cover-up. This is about evolution. Damien, still pinning Praya down, snarled. You're a monster. Mercer ignored him. The Drellzor are not our enemies. They are the next step. Humanity has always been bound by its own limitations. The Drellzor offer a solution. A perfect species, stronger, faster, immune to disease, to weakness. He paused. To free will. Elena's fingers twitched over her trigger. You're experimenting on our own people. Mercer didn't deny it. The United Earth Navy is securing the future. And Captain, you should be honored. Because you're about to join them. Elena's breath caught. Then, a terrible realization. Her gaze snapped to Reyes. He was still on the ground, groaning, his veins turning black, his fingers lengthening into claws. Oh my God, she whispered. The transformation had already begun. The impossible choice. Praya choked out. The UEN injected us. Before we left. Tiny nanites, just in case. Her voice broke. We're all infected. Belena felt the walls of reality closing in. Her team, her family, had already been turned into experiments. She had minutes before Reyes lost control completely. Before she did too. And above them, the Drellzor Queen smiled. Welcome to the future, human. The final battle and the ultimate sacrifice. The truth had come crashing down like a meteor. Elena Carter, captain of the UEN Valiant, stood in the middle of an alien hive, surrounded by the grotesque, mutated remains of men who were once human. And the worst part, she was next. A cold realization spread through her veins. The infection was inside her, inside all of them. Her team, the people she had trained with, fought beside, trusted with her life. They had already started to change. Reyes lay on the ground, his body shaking violently, his veins turning black, his fingers twitching into something inhuman. Praya, still pinned under Damien's grip, wept silently, knowing that her betrayal had doomed them all. Above them, the Drellzor Queen watched. She was massive, her elongated form coiled around the walls of the hive, her thousands of black eyes reflecting their fear. She smiled, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth. You have fought so hard, the Queen whispered into their minds. You have struggled, resisted, but it is pointless. You are already one of us. Elena's pulse pounded in her ears. She felt it now, a strange heat in her chest, something crawling beneath her skin. The nanites. The UEN's hidden betrayal, buried inside her bloodstream from the moment she left Earth. She had always been a weapon. She just hadn't realized it until now. The last stand. A loud snarl broke her thoughts. Reyes twitched violently, and then his body went still. For a second, Elena thought he had died. Then, he lifted his head. His eyes were no longer his. Glowing blue, inhuman, empty. Reyes lurched forward, faster than any human should move, claws slashing through the air, aiming straight for Elena's throat. Bang! A plasma bolt ripped through his skull, sending his body collapsing backward. Smoke curled from the barrel of Damien's gun. His face was unreadable. Elena stared at Reyes' corpse, her stomach turning into knots. Her friend, her officer, and she had watched him die as a monster. Priya screamed in anguish, but she wasn't looking at Reyes. She was staring at her own hands, watching them twitch, elongate, tremble. She was changing. "Kill me before I lose control," she sobbed. Elena hesitated. A part of her wanted to believe there was still time, that there was still a cure. But she knew better. This wasn't just a war. It was an extermination. Damien's plan. Damien grabbed Elena's shoulder, snapping her out of her thoughts. "We can't stay here," he growled. "The Queen has what she wants. She's just waiting for us to turn." Elena turned, glaring up at the massive alien creature above them. She was right. The Queen wasn't attacking. She was watching, waiting, smiling. Elena's stomach twisted. She had seen predators before, but this was a mother waiting for her children to come home. Her hands clenched into fists. "I'm not going to let that happen," she whispered. Damien exhaled sharply. "Good, because I have a plan." Elena turned to him. "We destroy the hive." She blinked. "You're insane. This entire structure is alive. It's massive. How the hell do you plan to?" Damien cut her off, his eyes blazing with a dangerous fire. "I know where its heart is." Elena stared at him, realization hitting her like a shockwave. Damien had survived down here for 20 years. He knew things the UEN never wanted anyone to know. "The Queen controls everything," he explained. "Every structure in this hive. It's connected. If we destroy the core, we destroy all of it. The Queen, the creatures, the infection." Elena felt a flicker of hope, a way out. But hope came at a cost. "You're saying we have to get to the heart of the hive," she said. Damien nodded. "And then we blow the whole damn thing sky high." Elena took a deep breath. Then she turned to Priya. Her friend was on her knees now, her body shaking violently, her eyes flickering between human and alien. She met Elena's gaze, and she nodded. "Do it," Priya whispered. Elena raised her gun. A single shot echoed through the hive. And then, without looking back, she turned to Damien. "Show me the way." The descent to the hive's heart. They ran. The deeper they went, the hotter the air became. The walls pulsed, the hive aware of their presence now, the Queen's voice whispering in their minds, taunting them. "You cannot escape. You are already mine." Elena gritted her teeth, forcing the voice out of her head. She wasn't going to be anyone's pet. Not today. Not ever. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they reached it. The heart of the hive. A massive, pulsating organ. A living, breathing core, pumping the infection throughout the colony. Damien yanked open his pack, pulling out detonation charges. "This will take everything out," he said. "The Queen, the creatures, the infection. But once I activate it, we have 5 minutes to get out." Elena nodded. "Let's do it." Damien set the explosives. The hive screamed. The walls convulsed. And then, the Queen's massive form slammed into the chamber. She wasn't smiling anymore. "You will not leave." The final sacrifice. The Queen attacked. Damien threw himself into battle, fighting with inhuman speed, slashing through her tendrils with alien-crafted knives. Elena fired every round she had left, dodging as the Queen's massive claws ripped through the chamber. Time was running out. Damien turned to Elena, his expression hard but determined. "You need to go." Elena's eyes widened. "What?" Damien's hand hovered over the manual detonator. "If you don't leave now, you won't make it." Elena shook her head. "No, we do this together." Damien smirked. "Not this time, Captain." And then, before she could stop him, Damien slammed his fist down on the trigger. The explosives activated. Elena staggered back as the chamber began to collapse. "Go!" Damien roared. Elena turned and ran. She sprinted through the tunnels, barely escaping as the hive imploded behind her, fire and shockwaves ripping through the underground structure. The last thing she saw was Damien standing tall, staring down the Queen, before the explosion swallowed them both. Then, silence. And EO7 was dead. The aftermath and the twist ending. The ground beneath Elena shook violently, the force of the explosion tearing through the hive. She didn't look back. She couldn't. If she hesitated, even for a second, she wouldn't make it. The tunnels collapsed behind her, fiery debris raining down. The alien walls shrieked, the entire structure dying as the heart of the hive was obliterated. Damien was gone. He had stayed behind, to make sure the Queen never left. Elena sprinted, her lungs burning, her vision blurring. The infection inside her veins still pulsed, but she didn't have time to think about that. All she could do was run. The escape to the surface. Ahead, a light. The exit. Elena forced herself to keep moving, pushing through the final stretch. Then, she burst into the open. The sky above was no longer red with alien light. Instead, it was on fire. Massive shockwaves tore through EO7, sending dust clouds into the air. The landscape split apart, erupting as the hive's destruction spread. The creatures, what was left of them, screeched in agony, their connection to the Queen severed. They collapsed where they stood, their bodies twitching and burning, the infection withering inside them. Elena staggered forward, barely able to stay on her feet. A voice crackled in her earpiece. "Captain Carter, do you copy?" It was a UEN transmission, the Valiant. Her ship. Elena gasped for breath, pressing her comm. "I'm here." Her legs gave out. The last thing she saw was the Valiant's rescue shuttle descending through the smoke, coming to get her. Then, darkness. Waking up, or something else. Elena woke up in a medical bay. Her body ached, her vision blurry. The soft hum of UEN technology filled the room. For a moment, she thought she was back home. Then, the memories hit her like a storm. The mission. The betrayal. The hive. Damien, her hands clenched into fists. He had died saving her. She swallowed hard, sitting up. "Status report." A robotic voice responded. "Captain Carter, you are aboard the UEN Valiant. Recovery time. 36 hours. Infection status. Stable." Elena's pulse spiked. Stable. She looked down at her arms. Her veins were still darkened, but the infection hadn't taken over. She wasn't human anymore. But she wasn't fully transformed either. A cold chill ran through her. What the hell had she become? Before she could process it, the doors to the med bay slid open. A figure stepped inside. Elena froze, because the man standing in the doorway was Damien Wolf. Alive. The twist ending. Damien's return. For a moment, Elena thought she was hallucinating. She had watched him die, had seen the fire consume the hive. But there he was, standing before her, looking exactly the same, yet different. His skin was paler, his eyes sharper, a strange glow beneath them. Something had changed. Elena shot to her feet, instincts screaming at her. "Damien." He smirked. "Miss me, Captain." She didn't lower her guard. You died." Damien stepped closer, his movements too smooth, too precise. "Yeah, about that." His smirk faded, his voice dropping lower. "I didn't make it out." Elena's heart pounded. She took a step back. Then, "What the hell are you?" Damien's expression darkened. "I don't know." He raised a hand, and something pulsed beneath his skin. For a split second, his veins flashed blue, just like the transformed men from the hive. Elena's breath caught in her throat. She reached for her gun. Damien lifted his hand, palm facing outward. "Easy, Captain." His voice was steady, but there was something new in it, something not quite human. Elena didn't lower her weapon. "You said the only way to survive this infection was to die," she whispered. Damien nodded. "Yeah, turns out." His eyes flickered with something ancient, something inhuman. "There's another way." The true horror revealed. Before Elena could respond, the room's emergency lights flashed red. A warning blared over the ship's intercom. "Unauthorized transmission detected. Signal origin unknown." Elena and Damien locked eyes. The transmission played over the speakers, a deep, resonant voice. One Elena had hoped was dead. "The Queen. Did you truly believe you could escape me?" Elena's blood turned to ice. Damien clenched his fists. No, that's not possible." The transmission continued. "You are mine now, human. And soon, all of you will be." Elena grabbed Damien by the collar, her voice deadly. "What did you do?" Damien didn't answer. Because, for the first time, he looked afraid. Then, the ship's systems shut down. The lights flickered, and outside the window, something massive moved in the darkness. A Drelzor fleet, heading straight for Earth.